Hello. Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to our public hearings on the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment, and it is a great pleasure for us to be here this evening in Fort Providence and on the traditional territory of the Dega-Goti First Nation. Always a pleasure as well to come down and join our fellow colleague, MLA from the Decho, Michael Nadley. And to get things started this evening, in fact, I'll ask Jennifer if you can bring a microphone over to Michael, and I'll ask everyone to stand, and we'll have Michael lead us in a prayer. Thank you.
Thank you and good evening, everyone here. Just been grateful for your safe arrival and the travel that you're doing, and for your families back home. Just wanted to acknowledge that our chief is not here because he had to travel for family reasons, and our condolences and thoughts go out to him and his family and the community here that's experiencing loss of a loved one, so we express that to them as well. And the legislation before us concerns the land, the environment, and things that we hold dearly to our minds in the small communities. And we've worked many years to be where we're at, but also at the reminding ourselves of the past, the elders, their words that we uphold. We ask for their guidance as we go through these legislations and working with each other, our communities and our families, and for the NWT. So with that, Masi, and have a good evening.
Amen. Thank you, Michael. We're very sorry to hear of the news, and our condolences to the family. I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity also to thank Victor Constant, who is doing interpreting services for us this evening. Thank you, Victor. And also to the community and those who put together the fantastic bannock and stew so that we could eat before this evening's proceedings. Thank you very much. As I mentioned, it's always a pleasure when we come down here to Providence. A couple years ago, all of the MLAs came down here for our caucus retreat, and it was amazing because the community came together with a number of boats and took us up and down the river, and we got some amazing pictures of the bridge, and we were able to stop and have a shore lunch sort of thing, and we hung around for 2 or 3 days of meetings, and one day was beautiful, sunny, plus 15, and moments later was a hailstorm that brought on, within the span of 5 minutes, we were just whited out. So always good memories and good times when we come down to Providence, and it's a pleasure to be back here. So welcome to our meeting on the Standing Committee of Economic Development and Environment. Today, I would like to also take this opportunity to introduce the members that are before you here today. On my far right is the MLA for Sawtoo, Danny McNeely. On my immediate right is the MLA for Frame Lake, Kevin O'Reilly. Frame Lake is in Yellowknife. On my immediate left is Kieran Testart, MLA for Cam Lake in Yellowknife. And on my far left is RJ Simpson, MLA for Hay River North. We also have with us from our committee clerk is Jennifer Frankie Smith, and our committee advisor is Stephen Dunbar on my far right. And in our Public Affairs and Communications Department, we have Chris Cartwright. Today, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment is holding our public hearings on Bill 38, the Protected Areas Act, Bill 39, the Environmental Rights Act, and Bill 44, the Forest Act. The Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment is a committee of regular members of the Legislative Assembly. The bills we are reviewing today were introduced by the Minister, given first and second reading in the Legislative Assembly, and then referred to this standing committee for review. Legislation is typically brought forward by Cabinet and is reviewed by Standing Committee. The members of this committee are responsible for holding the government to account, and one of the ways we do this is by making sure that proposed laws are supported by the people of the Northwest Territories. It is our responsibility to consult with residents on what they like or don't like about the bills. We would like to hear your views and comments, which will be used by the committee to identify any changes we would like to see made to the draft legislation, and which we will then report back to our colleagues in the Assembly. The Standing Committee is holding public hearings on these bills in Fort Smith, Katloditchi First Nation, Hay River, this evening here in Fort Providence, Betchico, Inuvik, and Norman Wells, before holding the final meeting in Yellowknife tomorrow night. And then we will report back to the Legislative Assembly on the proposed legislation during the upcoming August sitting of the Legislative Assembly. I wish to briefly describe the intent of these bills. Bill 38, the Protected Areas Act, proposes to establish new legislation that will allow the GNWT to create permanent protected areas in the NWT where there are important plants, animals, land, cultural, or historical sites. It also allows for co-management of a protected area with an Indigenous government or organization. The bill says what is allowed to happen in protected areas and what is not allowed. Mining exploration, oil and gas development and exploration, and energy developments are prohibited. Small-scale renewable energy projects may be developed within a protected area or by an adjacent community. Roads or power lines may be permitted with consultation of the Protected Areas Management Board. Bill 39, the Environmental Rights Act, proposes to change the existing legislation by protecting people's rights to a healthy environment, help ensure the GNWT always considers how the environment could be affected, and investigate when a person reports to the ministers that someone has harmed or could harm the environment. Gives residents of the NWT tools to help the GNWT protect the environment. The GNWT must write a report every 4 years on the state of the NWT's environment, which will be reviewed by the Legislative Assembly and allow time for public comment. Bill 44, the Forest Act, proposes to establish new legislation that will provide tools for managing forests and the use of forests in the NWT to keep them healthy, provide tools to prevent and respond to wildfires, create forest harvesting agreements, permits, and licenses, allows the GNWT to create rules around harvesting timber and create rules on burning outside communities, allows the GNWT to create rules for harvesting of other forest resources, such as berries, mushrooms, and other plants, and respond to insects, invasive plants, and forest diseases. Many of you, I notice, have already helped yourself. There are copies of the bills and plain language materials on the side table over at the rear. Again, if you haven't done so, I encourage you to please help yourself. If you'd like to share your views with us today, you're welcome to please let the clerk know. If not, I will just be simply asking later and you can raise your hands. I would also like to let you know that if you'd like to, we also accept written submissions by postal mail or by email until May 3rd at 5 p.m. One final piece of housekeeping. Please remember that all submissions will be part of official committee records and may be reflected in our final report. Any submissions made during this meeting may also be televised or this evening may be broadcast via social media. So I want to thank you, everyone, for your patience in allowing this introduction. And with members' agreement, we can now open the floor to comments from the public. Do members agree? Agreed. Thank you, members. So I will start. We'll open the floor to anyone who wishes to make comments on the three bills that we have before us this evening. And just a reminder, we have Bill 38, the Protected Areas Act, Bill 39, the Environmental Rights Act, or Bill 44, the Forest Act. If you don't have any direct comments, but if you have any questions or concerns, then we're certainly welcome to do our best in answering some of the questions that you might have. So if there's anyone who wants to start with asking us a few questions about the Protected Areas Act, the Environmental Rights Act, or Bill 44, the Forest Act, then we'd be happy to do our best at replying to your questions. Who wants to get us started? Okay, Greg, just state your name for the record as well, officially, Greg. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon or good evening, Greg Newley, and it's my first day back with the band here in Fort Providence. So, just a quick question on first one for now on the Environmental Rights Act. Just give me a kind of an idea of how the Environmental Rights Act plays in, given we have the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board. So, how are these two complementary, or are they contradictory, or how do they work together? Thank you.
So the question for clarification is the Environmental Rights Act and the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, and how they might, or sorry, okay. I'm going to actually turn this over to Kevin O'Reilly. He understands a lot of the history on the environmental rights bills that we've had in the past and how they might work in line with other acts. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the question, Greg. So the Environmental Rights Act was passed back in 1990, and it was a private member's bill. And it was done by a guy by the name of Brian Lewis. I don't know if anybody remembers Brian Lewis. He was an MLA for Yellowknife. And as I understand it, he saw that Michigan, one of the U.S. states, had an Environmental Rights Act, and he thought that it might be something of interest, worthwhile for people in the Northwest Territories. So he got it through the House, and there it was supported by the regular MLAs. A few things that it did do was it established the ability for any two people in the Northwest Territories to ask the Minister back then of Renewable Resources to carry out an investigation of release of a contaminant into the environment. And then the Minister, if the Minister accepted the request, the Minister would go out and carry out an investigation. As far as I know, there was ever only one request, and it was myself and another guy, Chris O'Brien. We asked for an investigation of the what was coming out of the giant mine stack. And so ENR went off and did some work on that, and it did result in some additional research that was done to look at the impacts of giant mine. But ultimately the mine closed, and that we're trying to do some remediation now in Yellowknife on that. So that was one of the things the Act did. Another one was that it allowed for an individual to go to court to try to protect the environment against release of contaminants into the environment. And you didn't have to prove to the court that you needed something called standing. That what it means is that anybody had the ability to go to court and start that a court action to try to protect the environment. But as people know, it's pretty expensive to get into court. Another thing that the current act, which is still in place, does is it protects employees if they give information about something being done that's harmful to the environment. Whistleblower protection, it's called. So employees can be protected. And then there was to be a report filed on an annual basis in the Legislative Assembly by the minister on things that were happening under the Act. And as we found out, the minister didn't always file those reports. I think that's the main things that were in the original Act. There's some changes being proposed, so that in fact the entire current Act is going to be repealed and a new one introduced. So there's going to be some changes to the way investigations are requested. There's also going to be a State of the Environment report that the chair mentioned every 4 years. It's not clear how that's going to be coordinated with other State of the Environment reporting. Every department and agency is also supposed to come up with a statement of environmental values. And it's not clear, and then they're supposed to make decisions consistent with that statement of values, but there's no oversight, no reporting required of that, so it's not clear. But it doesn't take away from any of the things that are already in the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, but it adds some extra ability for citizens to try to protect the environment. That's it, Mr. Chair, I think pretty quickly, unless there's any other questions that I could try to answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Good work. Good job on that. Appreciate that. We have another question over here, or comments. Jennifer will bring you the microphone. Please introduce yourself for the record. Speak closely to the mic there.
James Christie. How will the Environmental Rights Act affect areas that need cleanups from contaminants? I am curious about that. I know that there was I don't know if you could call it a cleanup, but that's what they called it when they did the airport. It was constructed by the Army, United States Army, I believe, in the 1940s. And community concerns were brought forward, and a type of cleanup was done, but it wasn't a good one. It was mostly just surface. I personally pointed out stuff poking out of the ground and other areas were identified where things were buried that were not cleaned up. The person that was operating that cleanup there, the consultant, I can't remember the lady's name, but they were concerned about digging in areas the Army buried things. They said, well, how do we know that we're not going to hit an explosive? Well, how am I going to know? I wasn't born in 45, you know? So there was just a kind of like a little surface cosmetic type of cleanup. But the contaminants and anything else that might be down there, it wasn't touched. And there's other areas that have been identified around our community and in our traditional area that will also be needing cleanups. Thank you.
Okay, and it was James, is that correct? Thanks, James. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for sharing your concerns. There's a lot of history of contaminated sites throughout the Northwest Territories, unfortunately, and we do have, while there's this particular act which is being repealed, and we're doing a whole entire rewrite essentially. There are other acts as well, the lands acts and what have you. It would have some degree of call it oversight that would have to do with contaminated sites. It's very hard for this committee anyway to get into the specifics of any given contaminated site, but as it relates to how this act and maybe even the Lands Act might pertain to your concern, again, I'm going to let our kind of resident committee expert on environment, Kevin O'Reilly, speak to that, because he certainly has had a lifetime of experience of both dealing with the land and environment in his previous professional experience, and so he's very familiar with these acts. So I'll let him comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the question. I know I had some people with renewable resources, or no, it was the, call it CARD, it was part of the federal government. They were asking me about Axe Point, which is pretty close, I think, to here during the Canal project, the Americans left some stuff over there. So generally, the principle is if somebody made a mess, they're supposed to pay for the cleanup of it. It's called a polluter pays principle. And trying to get the Americans though to clean up sites that they left here in the Second World War is pretty difficult. But the airport is now owned by G&WT, and they would really be responsible for cleanup of the airport here in Providence. And if they did one, there should be some records around that. And the Environmental Rights Act would give people the ability to say, you know, that they'd like to know what the remediation, the cleanup that was done. So you should, the Environmental Rights Act would give you the ability to find out that kind of information. You could also apply under access to information to get some information about what happened there. The G&WT contaminated sites, until they're fully remediated, they're supposed to be doing an assessment of it. There's various types of assessments that they do, and they're supposed to keep track of the liability that it would cost to clean up a site, and that goes into kind of like the financial statements for the government of the Northwest Territories in what's called the public accounts. So until the site's remediated, it's supposed to stay there as a liability. But I would suggest too that you probably have a renewable resources officer here in town that you might ask them to try to find out what was done at the airport in terms of remediation. I don't know, I hope that that's of some help. But I took a note here about it as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Does anybody else have any comments or questions with regard to this evening's bills? We have the Protected Areas Act, the Environmental Rights Act, as well as the Forests Act. If anyone would care to share comments or has any further questions? Jennifer. Please just say your name for the record. Thank you.
Yeah, my name's Susan Fleck, and I live here in Fort Providence for the past 8 years. Prior to this, I worked for the G&WT as a director of wildlife, and so I'm familiar with the protected areas process because at one point I was responsible for the G&WT part of it, and so I'm just happy to see a Protected Areas Act finally happening, and it also now allows for the protection of areas for conservation reasons, which the Territorial Parks Act has never allowed. So that was a gap in G&WT legislation, and it's being filled, and it allows a place to be protected to the maximum amount that the G&WT has authority for. So that's a great thing. I have a couple questions in relation to the Forest Management Act. For the last 8 years, I've been working as the executive director for the Decho Land Use Planning Committee, and one of the unresolved issues that the committee has had is in relation to harmonizing the Decho First Nations Interim Measures Agreement and potential Decho land use plan. And so specifically, there has been an issue with the IMA and the land use plan in relation to issuing timber permits. So under the IMA has a clause or sections in there that says that if a Decho First Nation or Métis Local or Decho First Nations doesn't want timber harvesting to occur, then under the IMA, they can say no. Now, in the Forest Management Act, it says something about they can refuse, the supervisor can refuse a permit if an Aboriginal, if Resource Council or I'll have to find the section again, says no. But I looked up the definition of an Aboriginal agreement, and I can't see that it includes the interim measures agreement for the debt show. It looks like it would address it once the debt show process is done, but in the meantime, the IMA exists, and it doesn't seem to be clear in the legislation that it would also include the IMA. So that's one point, and I can provide further information to the committee in a written form that explains exactly what the problem is. And my understanding was that the Forest Management Act renewal of it was supposed to address it. And the other one is in relation to the issuing of permits. And so, and specifically these free timber permits. So I can understand the need to require a permit to cut timber if you're cutting greenwood and there's a conservation issue. And so, and the department, everybody wants to manage greenwood. But when it comes to deadwood, that's anywhere out there, it's not gonna be more of it. It's not often that there's a commercial right issued for that reason. It's already dead out there. So I've never understood the need for a free timber cutting permit for dead wood. Now the other thing is that, so that would apply to everyone, but for Aboriginal people, they have an Aboriginal right to take timber for personal needs. And under this act, there is a clause that says a minister can create a regulation identifying who can be exempted from requiring a permit, but it would be more clear in the act if it said right at the upfront that an Aboriginal person exercising an Aboriginal right may cut timber without the need for a permit. And at the very front, in the section there's after you go through definitions, there's a section on 3, 4, and 5, which relate to Aboriginal agreements like land and resources agreements or legislation and that kind of stuff. But it doesn't seem to go into the permitting. It doesn't seem to carry over into the permitting section. So those are my 2 comments.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate you sharing those comments and raising those questions. I'll check with members here in a moment to see if anyone cares to comment in regard to that. But just so you know, we do have that now on note, and there are questions that we are also compiling that ultimately are going to form a number of questions that we're going to send back to the minister, but also will help us formulate our report. If you do want to put anything in with more clarity in writing, I would really encourage you to do that. And then please contact her. Jennifer will come around to you now, and she would give you her contact information. And if there's anything you would like to put in a written submission, we would love to have that. Okay. Did you have something more to add?
Yeah, I'm not going to put the free timber permit stuff in, but I will clarify the issue in respect to the Dutch First Nations IMA.
Okay, really appreciate that. Members, is there anyone who would like to comment in that regard? Mr. Simpson?
Thank you for those comments, and I don't really have answers for you, but I just wanted to let you know that we have heard the issue about the requirement for permits to exercise, Indigenous rights. We've heard that from other people, and that's something that I think we're going to have to address. And we've also heard as we were going around the territory, that a couple of these acts don't seem to recognize specific bodies or specific agreements, and so perhaps it needs to be something more general in the definition. But those are both things that we've heard, and they're definitely on our radar. So thank you for bringing them up.
Thank you. And next I have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We heard similar questions from other communities about the Act itself, which is laid out in the copies in the end of the table. Our committee inherited the Act that was developed by the government, and it's confusing for us to answer some of your specific questions because we never did draft the material that is there. The involvement of the drafting, as mentioned in the smaller document, was done in conjunction with the technical working group. But we are not a part of that working group. We take the material and bring it out on the road and gather your concerns, try to answer them the best we can, take the concerns, document it, and we publish a report based on what we heard. Very similar to other hearings. So if we're not providing you clarity, like our chair had mentioned, we'll get back to you on that. Or if you want to submit a briefing that would be included in our report, that would go back to the Legislative Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they would like to add? James?
I notice in the Forestry Act, that handout that says what we heard, it says that ENR is not proposing to regulate the personal use of non-timber forest products in the Forest Act. That in the sentence above it, it says for commercial harvesting of non-timber forest products to ensure sustainable use. There are some products, non-timber forest products, that can easily be harvested in an unsustainable manner. And I don't understand why it's not seen necessary to regulate it. How are you going to protect it? We know from that I think it was 2014 there, we had hundreds of people come in, and I saw them myself. I was out there, and they weren't only harvesting fire morels. If you go into their camps, they were taking chaga and other things that if you don't harvest it right, that's it, it's gone. It won't grow back. And there was nobody out there monitoring them or anything. Perhaps the resources aren't there. But if nobody's watching them and there's no penalties, how do you protect them from harvesting things that can't be harvested in a sustainable manner, especially people that don't know what they're doing? We had big groups from foreign countries like Cambodia and all that were out there. I mean, nobody's watching them and what they're doing. How are you protecting it for our residents? I just don't see how come you don't feel a need to regulate it.
Thank you, James. Mr. Simpson, if you care to reply.
Thank you very much. And yeah, and we're not the ones who don't feel the need. This is the government's bill, the cabinet, and they put it forward. But it's interesting because I see that you're reading from the What We Heard report, about the Forest Act, and they say they're not going to regulate the use of non-timber or the harvesting of personal use of non-timber forest products, but the Act actually does give the department the authority to regulate the harvest or use of non-timber forest products. So they say they're not going to in their material, but they give themselves the power to in the Act. And they say that they're going to develop regulations about that. So I think you pointed out something that's a little, they don't quite line up. So thank you for that, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Further to that, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we all know that the mushroom harvesting was created some problems, and I'm not going to defend what's in this bill. It came from cabinet, from the minister, but as my colleague Mr. Simpson said, that the bill would allow for mushroom harvesting to be regulated, that you'd have to get a permit to do that. There's also the ability in here for the forestry supervisor to develop forest ecosystem management plans that are supposed to do things like maintain ecological integrity, look at cumulative effects of forest use, encourage forest sustainability, those sorts of things. But the supervisor doesn't have a duty to prepare those plans. The supervisor may develop the plans. Some of the other folks that we've heard presentations from said that they don't think they think that those plans should be a duty for the supervisor. The supervisor shouldn't have a choice, and that once those plans are developed, you could only get a permit or a license if it conforms with the plan. So we've heard that kind of concern and concerns around monitoring as well. So appreciate you bringing them forward here this evening as well. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, go ahead first, James, and then we'll have Mr. Testart.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there seems to be a lack of awareness how valuable it could be. In BC alone, it's a $600 million industry, and it's not even known what's out there. There has never been an inventory done. It's not only mushrooms. There are medicinal plants out there that in some that are thought to grow here because they're at the same latitude as they are in parts of Asia that are very valuable, extremely valuable. But just getting back to that regulation, we know that there was an effort made by our MLA, Mike Natley, to have some regulations put in, but there seemed to be a lot of resistance to it. I don't know where it came from, but all I can say is I personally suspected that it was from probably lobbying from the oil and gas industry, who would be concerned of any conflict for their exploration and development of oil and gas. So I just was wondering if that was the case. Is the resistance to having regulations coming from the oil and gas industry? Thank you.
Thanks again, James. I think it would be difficult for this committee to kind of make that determination, so I'm not sure that we would really comment in that regard. As it relates to would that have been a concern of the oil and gas industry? I'm not sure that we're free to speak to that point, but I do know that Mr. Testart has more to add here. Just one moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, James, for your questions and comments. I mean, one of the reasons we come to communities on these consultations is to hear from people. We don't expect to hear from lawyers every time. We expect to hear from people who live under our laws and where these laws have impact. And certainly with the situation with the morals that you brought up and that I think everyone in Fort Providence experienced, that's the kind of thing that's really helpful for me as a legislator, because I can work with that experience to do our work to find out how we can make the laws better address the situation. So a big part of the Forest Act is going to be the regulations. So those are things that we have nothing to do with. It's the responsibility of the government, of the GNWT, to build those regulations. And we've heard from many Indigenous governments and organizations that they would like to be a part of that process. Mr. O'Reilly spoke about the forest management plans that the Act requires and some of the limitations behind that. I guess my question for you and for anyone else is how involved would you like your community to be in developing a forest management plan or developing a regulatory scheme for morals or for the forest surrounding Fort Providence? Do you see, is there a desire that there's lots of local involvement from the community, or at least from the Decho First Nations, or through your MLA? Like, what's the appropriate balance? How close do you want to be to whatever regulatory regime comes out? Because there are ways that this legislation could open that up for more consultation, more of a more direct consultation with the public on the development of these plans, and potentially the development of regulations or reviews.
Well, I think it's important that our community be involved in that. As you are aware, we have a forest management agreement, and we are still working with Aurora Wood Pallets to have a wood harvesting agreement and other agreements with them to move forward with that wood pellet idea. And we want it to work. Our community wants it to work. We need the opportunities it will provide. So yes, our community needs to be involved, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Anyone else have anything further to add from our side here on that comment? Further comments, questions, concerns from members? We have, just as a reminder, Bill 38, the Protected Areas Act, Bill 39, Environmental Rights Act, and Bill 44, the Forest Act. I do want to acknowledge that Grand Chief of the Decho First Nation, Gladys Norwegian, has joined us. Thank you very much, and I appreciate that I'm putting you on the spot, and I know you're enjoying something to eat. That you so we'll hear from you in a moment. But if there's anybody else in the meantime that would like to share any more comments or has any questions with regard to any one of the bills that are before us today, we will be happy to do our best and answer your questions. If there's nothing further, we certainly, Susan, maybe we'll get the microphone over to Susan.
It's a technical question. Usually when you're doing definitions, if you have a term, and there's an example of it in here where the definition of forest is, you normally don't use forest again in the definition. And it says a forest is trees, grass, vegetation, or other forest resources. So I don't know, I'm sure they struggled with that one. So there might be something that a researcher could look into and see if there's another way to do the definition without reusing that term forest in there.
Okay, and that's noted. Thank you very much, Susan. Okay. Oh, and just a reminder, because some people We are, as you know, we're also doing social media feed live, and so it's also a good time maybe to remind people that if you care to have a written submission put before the committee on any of these three bills, then we will be accepting written submissions until May 3rd at 5 p.m. So even if you might miss out an opportunity to present at a public hearing, we absolutely are interested in getting your comments or concerns or even questions for that matter sent to us in writing, and they will help us formulate our review and our reports. Anybody at the back? Anybody at the back want to share a comment or question with regard to any of the bills before us? Any comments, MLA Nadley? Putting you on the spot. Okay. If there's no further comments or questions at this time, just for what we're going to do is just take a break. I appreciate that there are some folks that are still getting ready that would like to comment, just not prepared at this time. So let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll reconvene shortly. We can get your coffees filled, your teas filled, and we'll start in 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We can reconvene our meeting just quickly. I just want to double check one more time because we're all here. So this is that opportunity that we want to hear from you. So if there is anybody that would just like to sneak in some last comments or a question with regard to the 3 bills before us this evening, we would be happy to hear from you. If we're all, okay. Jennifer, I'll have you bring the microphone over to the corner here for a moment, and please just state your name for the record. Thank you.
Thanks. Rosemary Gallen from Fort Simpson. My question is, how is climate change addressed in the Forest Act?
Sorry, which act? Did you say one specifically?
The forest or the environmental?
All right. Thank you for that. Is there any member that knows of a clause or anything that we have specifically as it relates to climate change and the Forest Act? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, Section 13 of the Forest Act, and there's a copy over on the side table there. Jennifer, could you see if you could get one there on the Forest Act? It's Section 13 says that the supervisor may monitor the state of the forest ecosystems in the NWT, including but not limited to, and then there's a bunch of things listed there. It includes forest health, forest carbon, forest change, wildlife occurrence impact, sustainable use, and any other matters the supervisor considers advisable. So it might get covered in the monitoring that's done by the supervisor. Jennifer, it's Section 13. We're just going to get you a copy of the bill. So I think that list of things could be interpreted in a way that might include climate change, but I think that's a good concern that you've raised. The problem with this is that it says the supervisor may monitor. It doesn't mean that the supervisor has to monitor, and then there's no reporting. So they may monitor all they want, but if there's no public reporting of it, how's anybody supposed to know the state of the forest ecosystem? So we've had that identified as an issue for us as well. But yeah. So thank you for bringing forward that concern.
Thank you. James, I'll go to you first, and then Mr. Testart.
Thank you. When forest fires are fought, what fires get fought and when are, I understand, are largely determined by some type of formula that uses values at risk. I don't know how those are determined, those values at risk. I mean, whose values? Is our traditional economy taken into consideration? Because I've never seen anyone come around here and hold a meeting and ask our community what areas we value. I think that needs to be done. It can't be someone just sitting in an office using some formula developed somewhere in Ontario or something that decides what our values are. We need to be heard from, especially in relation to our traditional economy. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and that's a very valid point you raise. It's not necessarily directly tied to the legislation piece. I think that that's more of a policy, and that certainly you would be expecting that the local office with regard to renewable resources might have some answers for you in that regard. Unfortunately, the committee is not at the call it level within the department's day-to-day ongoing operations to understand how they go about evaluating assets. There certainly is methods in place, and as you suggest, whether it's feet on the ground doing it or whether it's through some sort of digital or computerized formula in this region, I'm not that sure. So I would recommend that you do reach out to the local office to ask them what their method is, and if it's not feet on the ground, well then you're welcome to certainly give them that suggestion. But to the point of climate change, I think Mr. Testerard also wanted to add something to that. Just one moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had more of a question. So you asked how climate change was incorporated into Bill 44. And my question for you is, how would you like to see it incorporated in? Like, what kind of climate change related policy issues would you like kind of built into the bill? As our best guess, I think at this point, is Mr. O'Reilly finding Section 13, which has a may clause. So is there some kind of, it doesn't have to be a legal argument or technical piece, but I mean, what kind of broad climate change issues or values would you like to see put into Bill 44, the Forest Act, or any of the other pieces of legislation? Thank you.
Okay. Well, we know that in the north, it's warming up 3 times greater than anywhere else, right? So the wildfire season, it says Section 14, Part 4, in the Northwest Territories is a period from May 1st to September 30th. Now, when you consider climate change, you would think that fire season should be perhaps longer at both ends, right? But as well, is there any reference to the act about research done on climate change?
I'm going to let Mr. O'Reilly take a look here on the research piece, but I think many people, and including yourself, are raising some very valid points now around climate change and the weather patterns that we're starting to experience that are clearly more erratic. The department, though, does keep fairly close eye on the statistics of when the beginning and ends of certain seasons are, including the fire season. I mean, we have a number of resources, including, as you know, water bombers and stuff that have to be tuned up and maintained and ready to go when the season starts. We have to have proper staff hired and trained and ready to go, and so the department or the government has done a fairly good job in knowing when those seasons come. But you are right, you're probably raising a valid point that we may begin to see those seasons become longer over time, and so we might have to prepare earlier, add more resources earlier, etc. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the question. The minister has the ability to carry out a number of things under Section 7 of the bill, including conservation, development, management, protection, and utilization of forest resources. So management could include research. The minister can also develop and implement plans, policies, and programs. The supervisor carrying out his or her duties can consider traditional, scientific, or local or community knowledge that is made available to them. So I think there's a few places where research could fit in here. It could. I think we hear the concern. You'd like to make sure that it's included in and spelled out in here. And if they're going to carry out research, though, people need to know or find out about it. So there has to be probably some element of public reporting as well. So, but I appreciate the concern. Thanks.
Mr. Testart, you wanted to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think what I'm hearing at least is that you'd like some explicit references to climate change in the bill around adaptation, mitigation, research. Okay, and I'm seeing a nodding of heads. Thank you. And that helps, right? And research, yeah, because that's why we're here, right? To hear those concerns. We've heard a lot of concerns around things that are missing from Bill 44, in particular, the explicit reference to land rights treaties and coming agreements to co-management bodies, to resource councils, all these kind of things that could be in the bill to give clarity to the roles and responsibilities. We have not heard climate change, and now we have. And that's helpful, and we'll take a look at that. And not only does this committee have a responsibility to share with the public what we've heard through a formal report or through speaking on the floor of the House, but we also have the ability to propose changes to the legislation. And the minister does have a veto over those changes, but it doesn't mean we can't try to work with the minister's office to get those changes through. So not only are we going to share with the public what we've heard on this tour, but we're also going to be developing our own amendments to the bill, and this suggestion we'll look at, and if we can find a way to make it work in law, and the committee agrees, then we'll try to move it forward. So we can do a bit more than just talk about the issues we've heard about. We can actually do something to address them, and that's another part of why we're here in Providence today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got our microphone over here. Susan, another question or comment?
Just further to Rosemary's point about the act setting the wildfire season from May 1st to September 30th, and then it says the minister by order in writing may change or alter it. The minister would have more flexibility if it just said that they can set the season under regulations, and then in the regulation making section he can say that he could also change it by order, and then that way with climate change and things like that you don't have to change the act to change the season. You just change a reg, which is a simple thing to do.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you for that suggestion, that recommendation. Are there any further comments, questions, concerns with the bills before us today?
Just one
Rosemary?
Okay. The DECHO is working in partnership with Wilfrid University, and there's a project going on in Scotty Creek regarding climate change. Now, I'm just wondering if your act makes mention of promoting, research that will impact our environment.
Yeah, I think what it doesn't clearly, because of what we have shown you earlier in section 13 is about the extent of what we've determined so far where the act relates to research. So, but now we have your comment in that regard, and so we can certainly give that consideration as well. Thank you. So if there are no further comments, questions, concerns with regard to any of the three bills before us today, okay. I'll have Grand Chief Gladys Norwegian. I'll turn it over to you.
So in addition to Rosemary's question, first off, I want to say that, and I did mention to you during the break, that to push all these acts all together, or too many of them together, it is really quite, you have to pick one over the others, kind of a thing, because there's so many of them coming at you. So what I wanted to say is that for those three acts, it's just I've never really had a chance to really cross-reference to see if they really comply with each other. And so Rosemary's question about climate change make me think that why couldn't you have a climate change app?
Well, that's a very good point, and in this day and age, that's a great question, and I think that, you know, in some form or another, most governments have no choice anymore but to clearly work toward addressing the matter of climate change. The way in which our government so far is attempting to do that is through the formation of a strategic framework, and then they'll soon becoming a forthcoming action plan. They haven't really begun to outline this in the form of legislation, and whether they care to or not at this point, it's not going to be contemplated by the 18th Assembly, and I say that just given the amount of time that's remaining in the 18th Assembly, but that could certainly be a consideration that gets raised by candidates in the election period and gets brought forward as a mandate consideration in the 19th Assembly. But to that, Mr. Testart?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Grand Chief Norwegian. We aren't in control of the legislative process we find ourselves in now. These are public bills that were moved by the government, and actually several MLAs on this committee oppose the introduction of Bill 44 in particular because of the concerns that Indigenous governments and nations have shared with members before that happened. And we take that very seriously, at least I do. And I wish we weren't in this situation as well. These are major changes to how we do things, and we have precious little time to get things done. That being said, we have an obligation to be here and to work on these bills. Now, to a climate change act, this was actually something that another committee of the Legislative Assembly recommended after the Auditor General of Canada's climate change audit. And that committee, March 2018 is when we made those recommendations. And the Climate Change Act was one of them, also a general policy environment where climate change would be a consideration for everything government does. And that would be coordinated through the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Now, we have been eagerly awaiting a formal plan, as the chair said, to what they're going to do, what the GNWT is going to do to address climate change, and they're still not where they need to be, especially after the audit's been completed and after that other committees and MLAs have been asking to see it. It's a big issue, and we need to do more to address it. These bills, we can take a look at those elements that relate to climate change and see if we can insert it into the legislation as our role as a standing committee. But we still need the government to agree with us at the end of the day. And we haven't seen as much uptake on our recommendations to put climate change and adaptation in particular in the North front and center in how the GNWT operates. So it's ongoing work. I think the 19th Assembly is going to have to play catch up. Because we haven't taken that opportunity to do more with it. But certainly I have a great deal of sympathy for your concerns that these are big bills, they're coming very fast. We'll be back, we'll be in the date show next month to talk about mining and petroleum resources, then after that on lands. And it's all back to back to back to back, and we have until August to get all these things back. So we're going to try to work with the public, work with our cabinet, and work with each other to get the best bills possible. And if we can't do that, to do what we can to push these bills off to the future assembly where they'll have more time, more breathing room to make sure it's good laws that reflect the will of the people we serve and not just checking off boxes on the government's mandate. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further, Grand Chief, at this time?
I don't know if I can ask this question here, but I would like to know which MLAs voted for the Forestry Act.
Well, what I would suggest is we can get back to you with the Hansard recording of that. So that was a recorded vote, and so we can certainly.
Well, I can find it on the Hansard, I guess.
And we're happy to do that for you as well. So we can certainly do that. Yep.
Thank you.
If there's no further comments or questions from the public at this time, there are none, what? No, we're here for you. Please, Rosemary.
All these new acts, I know our population is aging, and I know in the Decho we have had staff from the ENR department recently retiring. I'm just wondering if the government has a succession plan to ensure that these acts are followed and monitored and...
Thank you. Well, that's a valid concern, and we've, again, as regular members, we have the opportunity to scrutinize all of the department's annual business plans that come before us. And this standing committee oversees or provides oversight on ENR, ITI, lands, Power Corporation, WSCC. So when they present to us, your point is a very valid one, where we ask the departments to show us their human resources plans. And I can advise that, again, in our recent round of reviews of business plans last fall, we shared our concern that a number of the departments did not have seemingly adequate human resource plans. So, and it's not to suggest that they're taking it lightly. They obviously know that there's a large age group within the government that's at or near retirement age, and that these plans are going to be certainly something that we're going to have to count on heavily going forward. Again, that's going to be a big challenge for the 19th Assembly. Did anyone else care to add to that, Mr. Testart?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Another great question. When the legislature passes a law, the government's obliged to follow that law, even if it's we have to be careful to make sure it can. But if it's a question of resourcing and the legislation, like the Forest Act says, the government must do these things, then it must do these things. It can't make best efforts to do these things. It can't try hard. It needs to do it to 100%. That's the standard set out in law. Where applicable. Now, regulations allow a bit more flexibility and they can change more, but statutes are relatively fixed. So it's once the law passes, everything in there has to be followed. So whatever's being set up in this legislation is going to be the law of the land for potentially a long time to come. Sometimes a bill doesn't get looked at for 10, 20 years. So that's why this process is so important. But your point about resourcing is very true. And that's why part of our function as legislators is to look at performance audits of the GNWT. That's what the Auditor General of Canada does, to see, is the government living up to its legislated requirements and the things it says it's going to do in regulation and in policy. So that's part of our function too. So if we pass this Bill 44, and it turns out, certain things weren't being done. Forest management plans weren't going to get done because of human resourcing issues or this or that. There would be an opportunity for the Legislative Assembly to look at what's being done, what isn't being done, and to take steps to improve it by issuing recommendations, and not just to ministers, but to public servants as well. And certain other steps as well, which can include changing up the cabinet or voting more money in a budget for that particular function. And that's how our legislative process goes. So, the law gets passed, the government has to follow that law. If it's not following that law, there is that accountability function of the Legislative Assembly. We look into it, we make those recommendations. So that's kind of the big picture of one of the very important critical functions of public government in the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Further to that, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to Rosemary for the question about succession planning and capacity of the departments. Each department has a human resources plan, and there is reporting of human resources stats for each of the departments once a year, and we get to see what the turnover rate is in each department, how many people have retired, that kind of information. We have identified this as capacity as an issue, particularly with ENR and Department of Lands. And we've heard now again this evening that there's some concerns about capacity to monitor and enforce. And Mr. Christie said much the same in terms of previous experience with mushroom harvesting. So I've noted your concern here, and that'll be something that we may be able to raise in our report moving forward in terms of, okay, departments have new legislation, they got to make sure that they have the capacity to administer and resource the legislation, have the human resources in place to do it properly. So thanks very much for raising it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lois Phillip. I'm just wondering about the Waters Act and the amendments. I'm wondering, working at the school and for many years bringing our students out on the land on a regular basis and having them create that connection, and noticing changes as we bring, as we brought the kids out for the last 15 years in terms of, say, water levels and water protection. And this is just me not knowing, what provisions are within the Act that we can begin to say, okay, how are the oil sands, or how are the Site C dams? How do we have that voice to say, wait, you're impacting us downstream? And I don't know. That's why I'm just wondering what provisions are within the Act.
Yeah, it's Lois? Thank you, Lois. Thank you for the question. And you're not the first one to raise these concerns and have these questions. I'll just share a general comment, is that we do have transboundary agreements, water transboundary agreements in place with a number of our shared borders with other provinces and other jurisdictions. That said, though, that the Waters Act is one of those acts that, clearly with consultation with Indigenous governments, the Indigenous governments felt that the Waters Act needed significant work, and between Indigenous governments and the government of the Northwest Territories felt that that act was not yet prepared and ready to come forward. So it is still in the works, and hopefully there will be consultation periods where the government with Indigenous governments and the public can have an opportunity for the public similar to this, and even more extensively be able to provide their input on that act when it comes forward. I can say confidently that it's going to come forward at some point in time in the 19th Assembly. And so it's, we don't have that act before us right now, but that act and another environmental act that were part of devolution are two that we realized needed considerable work yet to be done, and so those will come forward some point in the 19th Assembly. But certainly there is a very strong link to the Waters Act and the Environmental Rights Act that's before us, and of course later on you'll see us out on the road again in June, end of June. We're going to be out with the Public Lands Act, and there's a lot of interconnectedness there. Is there something that you wanted to share, Mr. O'Reilly? Yeah, I've just been reminded by my colleague that of the bills that we have remaining, the ITI bills that we will be bringing out, which is the Mineral Resources Act, the Petroleum Products Act, and the Oil and Gas Regulations Act. Those three will be coming out. We will be in Fort Simpson on May 10th for that. And then in June, is that 27th? We will be back here in Fort Providence for the Lands Act. So those will be ones that you will want to have representation at, or come attend yourselves if you can. I do want to also add that we apologize, as Grand Chief has indicated earlier, that, there has been a lot of pieces of legislation put onto our committee's plate, as well as a number of the other standing committees' plate in a very short time frame, with very limited resources and a lot of work with very little time. And so we didn't have the benefit of having one act with a lot of time and a lot of resources like you normally would. And so that's why you're even seeing us bundle the bills that we have before us. We're carrying 3 on the road now. We're going to be carrying 3 on the road in May, and then we have another one that we're taking on the road in June. And so that's not, well, some would suggest that that's normal in the last year of the Assembly. Most who have indicated to us that have been involved in the past, that's not normal. And so it's a significant workload, and we've had to be, unfortunately, a little bit picky as to where we can go and get the most feedback we possibly can to be able to get the concerns and questions asked so that we can do as best a review as we possibly can. So we appreciate that everyone is, while they would really like to see us come into their communities, we haven't been able to make it into to all of them. And this is the time where I try to remind folks that while we may not make it into some of your communities, we take anything in writing. So we want to hear your thoughts, whether it's just an email, whether it's something formal from an Indigenous government or from a legal team. We're happy to get your thoughts. So with that, it's been a good evening. I really appreciate everybody's comments and sharing your concerns and asking us some questions. And if there's nothing further at this point, I want to thank everyone for being here again. Thank you for the meal. That's greatly appreciated. And we can be adjourned. Thank you.